Hello everyone! So today I'll be showing you how to secure your computer BIOS. It stands for the Basic Input and Output System, and every computer has one, including Macs, although with Mac computers it's a little different. So this video is only for every other computer. The reason why it's important to secure your computer BIOS is because it has a lot of settings that basically set the tone for the entire system. So, for example, if you allow USB booting, that means a person who doesn't like you very much can put in a flash drive that contains a different operating system and boot into it with no password or anything using your computer and change your internals as much as they want using disk partitioning software, for example. So to prevent that, we will go over what to do in this video so that you are secure and you have a password for accessing sensitive settings in your BIOS. So the first thing I will do is boot the computer on. You'll see a splash screen for about half a second, press enter, and then you have 4 options in my case. I will press F1 to enter the BIOS setup utility. Alternatively, you can press F12 if you want to boot into USB and so on, but in this case we are editing the BIOS, so we are entering the setup utility. And on this main screen you see a lot of info right off the bat. For example, there's the BIOS version, your CPU type, amount of memory you have, etc., your MAC address, whether you have secure boot enabled and so on, but it's not really important because we will go through all those settings and change them accordingly. The first screen that we see here is called config. So in our case, it's kind of the configuration for various hardware that we have in our computer. So I've decided to skip over all of these settings except for Thunderbolt, as that is more of a security concern, but otherwise you can set all these settings as much however you like. So we will go straight to Thunderbolt. And here, the first thing we see is Wake by Thunderbolt. So this allows you to wake up the computer via a device that's connected to the Thunderbolt port, like maybe via a docking station or directly. So if you do enable this, then, it will use a bit of battery to be able to do that. But if your docking station happens to be charging your computer, then it doesn't really matter. So you can leave this on disabled so that you have to physically turn on your computer instead of using an external device from a Thunderbolt dock. And the next option we have is security level. So this allows you to choose basically the security level of your Thunderbolt port. I will leave an article in the description that describes these options, but essentially no security means just that. There is no security checking. The next option is user authorization. So that is, I believe, you have to authorize a new Thunderbolt connection each time. Then the Secure Connect allows you to basically connect a new Thunderbolt device once, and then it'll remember it and automatically recognize it. Kind of like when you connect a Android phone to your computer and it asks you whether you want to trust the computer. And you say yes, trust, and then it remembers that that's a trusted computer, so it won't ask you anymore. So that is like Secure Connect. And then DisplayPort and USB is, I believe, only DisplayPort and USB are the options that will work without user authorization. So everything else that you want to connect will be, you will have to authorize. So I think the best option here is, and the most convenient one is Secure Connect. And then we have support in pre-boot environment for Thunderbolt devices. So it says pre-OS support for Thunderbolt devices attached to Thunderbolt 3 port. So if it's enabled, then they will be connected before you boot into your operating system. Pre-boot ACL is the best option here, which essentially follows your security level that you just set. So it says Thunderbolt devices to be connected after the user authorization or automatically with security level no security. So if you choose pre-boot ACL, then basically if you have Secure Connect, then once you've authorized it once, it will remember and be able to support the Thunderbolt, the trusted Thunderbolt dock in a pre-boot environment. Next option is date and time. I'll skip over that. You can change it to whatever you wish. It doesn't affect security much, but just make sure it's current. And this is the most important tab here, is called security. So we'll start by setting a supervisor password. So supervisor password prevents people from changing your BIOS settings. So you want to have that set up, and then we will enable certain settings that will make it harder for people to change stuff on your computer without typing in that password. So we just set a password there, and now it's enabled. Next option is lock UEFI BIOS settings. We want to enable this. This will essentially say what I just pointed out. We will lock the settings from having changes made without typing in the password. And then the next few options here are password and unattended boot, restart and boot device list. So I think it would be too much of an inconvenience to have the first two turned on, especially when you might have ideally a disk encryption password and a password to get into your actual operating system. So I would probably enable the boot device list password, as that allows, let's say, an attacker to easily boot into a different operating system off a flash drive using your computer, even if you have all sorts of passwords on there. But this will prevent the attacker from gaining access to that boot device list so that they can't boot without typing in a password. Next is password count exceeded error. Basically, it will show an error if you type the password too many times incorrectly. No reason not to have this enabled, so put it on enabled. Next is you can set a minimum length for your password, but ideally just make the password reasonably long. Let's say at least 8 characters, random letters, symbols, numbers, all that. But if you really want to kind of set a standard for yourself, you have to keep to that standard. Maybe you change it frequently, change your password frequently, or want to, then you can change it to a minimum of however many characters you want. But I'll just leave it on disabled. You just have to understand that the longer the password is, the better. But don't go overboard, because you'd still have to type it in once in a while. And then the next two options are power on password and hard disk password. So these are kind of silly. Like, for example, the power on password, we already went through that. Basically, you'd have to type in this password to make the computer turn on. I don't think this really prevents the attacker from really booting your computer if they want to, as it would have to kind of turn on in the first place for it to ask you the password. And the hard disk password is even more silly, as it doesn't encrypt your drive or anything. You need to do that in the OS when you install it. All it does is kind of prevent access to the hard disk through this computer, so you could easily take out the drive and put it into another computer, and you won't need to type in that password anymore. So just leave them on disabled. So next option is ThinkPad specific, or maybe some other laptops have it. It's called a fingerprint. So if your password has a fingerprint sensor, then there's a few options here. One is pre-desktop authentication. So this enables you to, as it says, authenticate before you enter the desktop. Enabling this would essentially allow you to use your fingerprint instead of your password, your BIOS password, for things like, the hard disk password that we just discussed, or the power on password. So if you did enable that anyway, for like the utmost security, you can also enable this, and then you can use your fingerprint instead. But maybe for utmost security, you would actually have it disabled, because biometrics aren't as secure as a password. Next, if you have an external fingerprint reader, then change this to external. Otherwise, leave it on internal, as that's your embedded fingerprint reader. And then the security mode, essentially either normal, requires power on or supervisor password to boot into a system when you have no fingerprint, or high, which means specifically only the supervisor password is accepted. As that is the only password that we set up, we only set up the supervisor password, then just change this to high. These settings won't affect anything because we did disable the power on password and so on, but if at any point you're going to change it, you're going to have the right settings already with the stuff that we set up. So just change it to high. And next we have password authentication. So as it says, users are authenticated by passwords when fingerprints are not available. So it's better to leave this enabled, as you should be able to use both fingerprint and password. And next, finally, you can reset the fingerprint data. So you can press enter and have it basically erase all the previous remembered fingerprints. So unfortunately for me, I had my fingerprint thing disabled in the settings, so it doesn't recognize that I have a fingerprint reader attached. But let's say I reset it. You'll basically get a screen that says it's all reset. So if you already have a fingerprint remembered, maybe you don't want to reset this, but if you weren't using the fingerprint reader, might as well reset it. Maybe there's some old ones saved there. And our next option is the security chip. So you want to change this to TPM 2.0. Basically, this is an updated mode for the security chip that's in your computer. And you want to also enable the security chip, as it's much better than using the processor itself for storing your keys and such. As you can see, if you change it from 1.2 to 2.0, it will say that it'll clear all the keys. So this might cause damage to your operating system that's already installed, so just keep that in mind. You might have to reinstall. But if you understand that, then you can go ahead and change it to 2.0. And then we have the security reporting options. A lot of these reports you probably will never use. So I would just disable this, as things like that have a tendency to leak information. So I would just disable this. If you need it enabled, you can go back at any time and enable it to see what your issue is. And then the next option is just to clear the security chip, just like we did the fingerprint. So if you wish, you can clear all the keys in there. And as it says, this will also might cause issues with your current installed system, if you have an operating system installed already. So it says it will not be possible to access already encrypted data after these keys are cleared. So if you clear these keys and you have, let's say, an encrypted operating system installed, then you may not be able to log into it anymore. So just keep that in mind when you clear this. Next we have physical presence for provisioning and for clear. So this essentially just has a confirmation screen before you do anything stupid, like for example clear your security chip, or when you change the security chip. So just leave both on enabled. Next we have UEFI BIOS update options. So this basically allows you to change this BIOS utility that we're in. If you want to downgrade your firmware for some reason, like let's say the newer version like messed up your computer somehow and you want to roll it back, these settings will either allow you or deny you the ability to change the BIOS or reflash the BIOS. So in this case, ideally you would disable flash BIOS updating by end users, so that an adversary is not able to, reflash the BIOS and install some kind of like corrupted version. And then the next option is secure rollback prevention. So this will also prevent flashing, as it says, older versions of UEFI BIOS that might have some security holes that can be exploited. And the Windows UEFI firmware update, this is just a really convenient way to update your firmware on your computer. So I would just leave this on enabled if you use Windows. Next is memory protection, really simple. Execution prevention, just enable this. This is basically a way to prevent buffer overflow attacks, which is like a memory-based attack on your computer. So this allows applications to take advantage of this data execution prevention. Next is virtualization. So if you're going to be running virtual machines, if you don't even know what that is, you probably won't. So then you can disable both. But if you are going to run a VM, then you can enable both of these, as Intel has some integrated capability that helps with virtualization. So then you can leave both enabled. And next we have I/O port access. So this is where I disabled my fingerprint reader. So this basically is like an easy yes or no, whether you want to allow each like individual piece of hardware to be enabled or disabled. So there's the Ethernet, wireless, Bluetooth, USB, memory card, camera, fingerprint, Thunderbolt, and then the WiGig dock thing. So for example, if you're not using Bluetooth ever, you don't plan on it, then you can disable it, as it is kind of a security risk. USB, definitely going to be using that, so you can leave that on enabled. If you're never going to use Ethernet, then you can disable that, which is, you know, like a internet cable that you plug in physically instead of using Wi-Fi. If you're not going to use the camera, you can also disable this. Thunderbolt, in my case, I have that common issue with the ThinkPad where the Thunderbolt port doesn't work, so I can just go ahead and disable that, as the ThinkPad docks still work that have that connector on the bottom of the laptop. And the WiGig device, I would also disable that unless you know what you're going to be using, that you're going to be using one of these, as one of those wireless connections seems like a security risk. And then in here we have internal device access. So this basically allows you to prevent tampering with the laptop. So if someone were to like break into your laptop and change the hardware, they would have to type in a password beforehand to actually boot the system with the changed configuration, so they'd have to know your supervisor password. And internal storage tamper is basically the same thing. These both are the same. So I would just enable both of them, since we set up a supervisor password. If you want to change something in your laptop, after you change it, if it detects that you've been tampering with it, you'll just have to type in your supervisor password that we set up earlier. And this next option is called CompuTrace in the anti-theft section. So this seems like rather archaic, and I've never actually heard anyone using this, so I personally permanently disabled mine. But before you do that, this is permanently disabled, so if you plan on like reselling it, or this is like a work computer that you got, you best just leave it on disabled. But if you know what you're doing and you're going to be using this, I'm not even sure how it's used, then you can enable it. Next is secure boot, which is also rather important. Probably the second most important thing is to set up secure boot. Basically is to prevent, as it says, unauthorized operating system from running at boot time. So if you enable this and reset it to setup mode, when you reinstall your operating system, it'll basically set up secure boot for you, so that it knows the operating system you boot into is the trusted one, and if people try running something else, they'll need to reset certain things or type in the supervisor password, so they won't be able to boot into whatever system they want so easily. And you also have an option here to restore factory keys that are basically made for, it says it includes a certificate for Microsoft Windows 8. This probably also works for Windows 10, so if you're going to be running Windows 10, you could restore these factory keys. If you don't have secure boot yet, I would suggest clearing all the secure boot keys and then reset it to setup mode, and then installing your operating system, and it'll enable secure boot for you. Next is Intel SGX. So this is a software guard extension function that the Intel processors have. So you should just turn this to enabled. Software controlled feature, it's basically enabled, but it detects like various software. I'm not sure how effective that is. You might as well just enable it. I haven't noticed a difference in anything, any applications running, so maybe you could just leave this on enabled. Next is Device Guard. So this is some kind of Microsoft specific feature. So if you know what that feature is, then you can enable it, and if you are using Windows, maybe this will be handy, but personally I'm gonna leave it disabled. And then we have the Startup tab. Here we can just see the boot priority order. For example, I've installed Ubuntu on this before, I've installed cubes, and all these things, they kind of are remembered in the boot priority order, and it'll change depending on what software you have installed. And you can also change these to, like, for example, if your primary operating system, like let's say you have number 1 Ubuntu, if Ubuntu doesn't load, it'll then try to load cubes. And then we have a network boot. So I'll just leave this on default, as I'm not entirely sure what this does, but PCI LAN seems like a good option, as it's probably the default one. Then we have a UEFI legacy boot. So if we have secure boot enabled, it'll only support UEFI. So that might be an issue if you're trying to load up some like old operating system, but for the majority of us, this is not an issue. So they are grayed out for a reason. And then we have boot mode quick. The splash screen doesn't show, and you kind of get into your operating system quicker, but if you're like working on something on the computer and you just want to have a little more time to get into diagnostics, then you can change this to the diagnostics option. But for most of us, just leave it on quick. Then we have option key display. So this will basically show the message at startup that says press enter to, get into the BIOS utility or whatever. So just leave it on enabled so you always know where to go when you boot your computer. And then we have the F12. We can press F12 to go to the boot device list. Like if you're trying to boot it from a flash drive instead, you can just press F12 on boot and that'll work. Or, enter first to get into that diagnostic screen and then press F12 as an option. So just leave it on enabled if you are going to be booting from a flash drive at some point, like to install Windows or to install Linux or anything like that. Otherwise, you can disable this, but I would enable it. And then we have the boot order lock. So this will basically lock the boot priority, so an adversary can't just change the boot priority around and have you boot from like a CD or something first instead of your operating system. So you can enable this, but sometimes when you install an operating system, and if you are just going to reinstall the operating system to like set up secure boot and all that, then you can disable this temporarily and then put it on enabled once you're done. So if you use a bunch of operating systems, I would disable this, but otherwise maybe you should enable it. And that's about all. So all you have to do now is basically exit saving changes. Make sure your option says something like save and exit, or exit saving changes. So this will basically save the changes in your BIOS and reboot. And that's about all you need to know. So now your BIOS is secure.